All right, so I'm right here on behalf of the DRELT chat team interviewing Scott Thornbury. If you don't know him, he's one of the authors of Teaching Unplugged, among many other books, right? Like Beyond the Sentence, How to Teach Vocabulary, and lots of different books. It's a great honor to talk to you, Scott, and to help us a bit on our discussions.
Henry, the honor is mine. The honor is mine. This is the least I can do to return the favor that you looked after me so well at the conference in Brasilia at the Brastisol. When was it? About 4 or 5 years ago now.
Yes, exactly. It was in 2006.
Exactly, and you were one of the hosts, and I remember you you were very helpful. So this is one way of returning that favor.
Oh, thank you so much. So on our last discussion, we started talking about Dogme, and one of the things that happens here in Brazil is that many people still don't know what Dogme is. They haven't really heard of that. And one of my friends was following the discussion, and he asked me a question which might be a starting point for us to talk a bit about Dogme and try to define it briefly, of course. Which is the word dogme is too closely, it sounds too close to dogma. And that will give the idea, a negative idea, right? You have to follow a set of principles and that's it. Perhaps you could talk a bit about that and also about the principles of Dogme.
Yes, I mean, I think Dogme, when it started as a kind of an analogy, basically, that I drew as a teacher trainer in my work 10 years ago here in Barcelona, Spain, working with in-service teachers and being frustrated by their lack of, or the lack of communicative interaction in the classrooms, which although they paid lip service to the communicative approach, but there didn't seem to be much real communication in the classrooms. So one of the things we were trying to instill in these courses was giving more space to the learners. And it also occurred to us, my colleague and me, who were tutoring these courses, that one of the reasons why there was so little space for the learners because there was so much activity going on, which was kind of focused on materials or other kinds of aids. So this was, we're talking 10, 11, 12 years ago, so it wasn't so much technology, but it was certainly very course book driven, and it felt that this was sort of kind of getting in the way of the possibilities of real communication. So the analogy that I saw between the then very popular Dogme film movement, the group of Scandinavian filmmakers who were, in a sense, rebelling against the kind of big budget, special effects, top-down kind of movie making that was emanating from, or still does, emanate from Hollywood. And so they created their film movement in 1995 and called it Dogme. And I thought that was an interesting analogy. So I wrote a little article about it. I mean, literally a one-page article, just saying maybe we need to be thinking of a similar kind of rescue action for English language teaching, rescuing the real communication from the kind of the hegemony of the course books. So it was, as I say, it started as an analogy, and oddly enough, it caught on very quickly. In a sense, it wasn't meant to be a movement, but a number of people contacted me about this and wanted to pick my brains about ways of actually implementing this kind of materials light approach. One of whom was Luke Meddings, who I know you've already spoken to. So we started a discussion group on the internet, and things kind of snowballed, and I started doing workshops. In fact, I did a couple in Brazil, I think, at some point, probably. And by that stage, the name had kind of stuck, and we realized quite quickly that it was not the right kind of name to be associated with a movement which was all about, freeing teachers and liberating them from the tyranny of the course book. But unfortunately, so we tried to kind of rebrand it very early on as Teaching Unplugged, by analogy with that kind of music movement of guitars unplugged, etc. But the Dogme thing just stuck, and we couldn't shake it off. So it is unfortunate. But I think coming back to the import of your question, what is Dogme? I think that also has changed over the years as in a sense the collective base of teachers who are interested in this so-called approach has expanded into very many different contexts, and in a sense, it's in a sense an emergent phenomenon. It's kind of developed a life of its own. So that's what prompted Luke and me a couple of years ago to write Teaching Unplugged, which is with a strapline, Dogme in English language teaching, which is an attempt to kind of nail down what it had become, and also to kind of create it to construe it in a more positive light, because it had got this reputation, I think, certainly, I mean, partly justifiably, that it was a kind of anti-movement, anti-course books, anti-technology. So we wanted to in a sense demythologize it a little bit and show that no, it's not so much anti things, it's actually pro the learner, pro the learner's voice, pro giving the learner some kind of autonomy, pro giving the learner some kind of agency in the classroom, pro opening up the space in the classroom and freeing the space, which is now from the things that were kind of cluttering it up, which are now actually possible to do much more effectively outside the classroom thanks to technology. And I'm thinking of all the kind of boring grammar exercises and that you don't actually need to do in the classroom because you can do them home on your computer. And in fact, they're no longer boring, they're all fun because they've got bells and whistles on them. So all sorts of things have happened in the last 10 years. And when we wrote the book, what we did was we extracted these three core principles, which we felt was still common to however people were interpreting dogma. The first principle being that that teaching should be driven, well, what we call conversation-driven, although conversation perhaps sounds too informal, but it should be, as much as possible, the teaching interventions that the teacher does should be based on what comes out of the talk in the classroom, the exchanges between the students and between the teacher and the student. So that should be the raw material, if you like, out of which the teacher can fashion language learning opportunities. Go on.
I think that's a very important point that you raised, because sometimes when we talk about conversation-driven, there's the opinion that it's just about having a conversation in class. And actually, it's the teacher learning how to take advantage of anything that they are talking about, that students are talking about, and use that as a learning opportunity then. Is that it?
And I think, exactly. And I think, and actually I've just blogged about this literally this week on my blog, trying to deal with that misconception that dogma classes are simply conversation classes and it's just people sitting around chatting. And maybe conversation was the wrong word. And I tried to rehabilitate the term dialogue. And my reference here is of course, to Paulo Freire, because his dialogic pedagogy was founded on the notion that all teaching should be based on the content that's generated in the dialogue between the students and the teacher. I'm telling you something you know already, and forgive my mispronunciation of his name. But I mean, Freire was very much a kind of feeder, intellectual in a sense. His ideological point of view, his pedagogical point of view, very much supports a kind of dogma kind of philosophy. And so dialogue, whatever, even though it's engineered and it's quite formal, but that it's the difference between being driven by the syllabus which comes from outside the classroom via the course book typically, as opposed to being driven by the syllabus that emerges in the classroom, and that's the one which the learners need, because it's if you're responding to their needs rather than some absentee coursebook writer's conception of their needs, you're more likely, we think, you're more likely to engage the learners and interest them, and also they're more likely to learn. Now, there's all sorts of problems associated with that, management problems, we'll come back to those, but so whatever you want to call it, but essentially it's a dialogic pedagogy rather than a transmission pedagogy. Transmission pedagogy being, I'm the teacher, I have the course book, today is Tuesday, I'm going to teach you the present perfect continuous. No, dogma philosophy is, okay, we're going to do a task, we're going to have a discussion, we're going to have a debate, or we're going to watch a movie or something, and then out of the discussion, it's a task-based approach, essentially. I'm going to identify some things that I think you need help with. maybe vocabulary, maybe grammar, maybe whatever, to make you more communicatively effective based on what comes up. And that's essentially the approach. So that's why it's anti-course book. It's not anti-course book so much as anti-course book syllabus. The syllabus being probably only going to be accidentally appropriate for the learners. That's the argument. Shall I go on to the second point? The second point really follows from the first, is that teaching should be materials light, in the sense that because the materials, the best material in the classroom is the learners. And so you don't actually need a lot of other stuff. And as I said before, a lot of the other stuff is better done outside the classroom. And the third point was that, what I've already said, that then the teaching should be done based on the language issues that emerge out of the classroom. So it's an emergent syllabus as opposed to an imposed syllabus. So those are the three kind of basic pillars, if you like, of the Dogme approach as we saw them retrospectively, if you like, 10 years later, as they had kind of emerged.
Okay. When you talk about that it's materials light and it focuses on language that emerges from the learners, in the Brazilian setting, for example, we're driven by a course book, and that's the syllabus, usually in most schools, including their private language institutes and regular schools. Is it possible in this kind of educational situation, is it possible for teachers to still break away from the syllabus and try to use some Dogme style teaching, and some Dogme style lessons in the teaching?
Yeah, I think it is, Henrik. I think, in fact, when I think back to the kind of teaching that I was doing at the same time that I was teacher training, and I was working in an institution where there were mandated course books and tests and everything. It was a private language school, so it wasn't perhaps as driven by syllabuses and exams as some institutions, but nevertheless, the expectation was, because the students had bought a course book, that we had to use it. Now, the thing about course books is, okay, as I said before, one of the things, my chief argument with them is this kind of the grammar-driven syllabus, and they haven't always been grammar-driven, actually. There was a period in the 70s to the mid-80s when I was actually teaching a lot, where they were driven much more by communicative syllabuses and functional syllabuses, and that was because of the communicative approach. And then everything went back to grammar-driven syllabuses in the mid-80s, and hasn't really moved away from that, but that's another story. But the thing is, about course books, they're not as bad as all that. Course books, and I know because I've actually written course books, and a lot of my friends are course book writers, and I've actually advised, I still do, I advise publishers on course books. I'm often brought in as a consultant. Course books are a lot better than they used to, and one of the reasons they're a lot better is they've woken up to the fact that they need to be topical and relevant. They need to engage the learners, and so they do have much better topics and texts than they used to, and also they have much better tasks than they used, particularly in terms of speaking or fluency tasks. And those, if you take away the kind of grammar-driven stuff and just look at the topics and the texts and the tasks, you've got fantastic material for a kind of more task-based approach. I remember actually I was observing a class here in Barcelona in a Escuela Oficial, which is a kind of government-run language schools for young adults, and the teacher showed me very proudly. I was going to observe this teacher. She's a Catalan teacher of English. And she showed me a copy of a well-known course book at the time, which is very, very grammar-driven. And she showed me all the bits that she'd actually scored out with highlighting. She said, I don't do grammar. So she just eradicated all the grammar stuff. And she used the book purely as a skills book. And I was kind of impressed by the boldness of this, because it was a very grammar-driven book, but she still felt there was enough in it to make lessons out of, and I think that is one. But it takes a certain kind of mentality. I remember when I was teaching and using course books, I remember a conversation I had in the teachers' room with one of the other teachers, and we're both teaching the same level and using the same book, and so we'd periodically, compare notes on how we're doing. And I said to her, what unit are you on? And she said, I'm on the second conditional unit. She said, what unit are you on? And I said, I'm on the unit about money. And then we looked at it and we were talking about the same unit. But you see, my way of looking at it was from the topical, thematic point of view, and she was looking at it from the kind of grammatical point of view. And I think it's just a different way of looking at the same thing. It's like the three blind men and the elephant kind of thing. So you can approach a course book like an elephant, and you can pull on the tail, or you can pull on the trunk. But you know, whichever one you you see what I'm getting at. I mean, but I think you can actually teach very successfully using course books, but you focus on the topics and things, and then you generate stuff from the students about those topics that they're interested in. So if there's a topic on money, then don't start with the course books. Start with having them create a survey in groups about attitudes to money, you know, what they spend stuff on, you know, a task-based thing. They go around, they survey each other, they collate the results, they draw a pie diagram of how the class distributes its money or its shopping time or whatever. They report to the class. You've got a whole hour or 2 hours of lessons there before you even open the course book. So, I mean, I think, yeah, there are ways where you can marry the dogma with a kind of course book.
I think that one of the things that does is you're empowering your learners, and you can actually profit a lot more from peer teaching as well, right? You don't risk over-teaching your learners because they have different backgrounds. So if you ask them about money, what do you know about money? And one student might be teaching the other. And if you're following the course book, you might end up teaching them something they already know.
Absolutely.
Even before checking with them.
Absolutely. And see, one of the questions that I get asked constantly, and I'm sure it's also symptomatic of the Brazilian context, is you have teachers in Spain, teachers in Japan, teachers everywhere I go. People say, what do you do with the problem of diversity in the classroom, mixed level classes, for example, mixed ability students, etc. And say, well, that is a given. That's all. You're always going to have mixed diversity in the classroom. I mean, sometimes it's extreme, but there's always going to be diversity. Now, how do you meet diversity? Do you meet it by having a very narrow syllabus? You know, so today we're going to do the present perfect continuous. What chances have you got of meeting that enormous diversity in the classroom by taking this very, very narrow view of things? Why don't you have a broad syllabus, which is saying, okay, what we're going to do is talk about money in this unit, and everybody can be involved at their level of ability. So when they're writing their survey questions, some people will say, you know, do you have money? Other people will say, if you had £1,000, you know, dollars, whatever, what would you spend it on? So everybody can. This is what Penny calls in her grammar book, wonderful grammar book for Cambridge, grammar practice activities. I think she calls it heterogeneous activities. So where a kind of activity where the student, whatever their level, can somehow contribute. And that's, you see, that's what I call a broad band syllabus, as opposed to a narrow band syllabus, which is the kind of grammatical syllabus. Because the grammatical syllabus, as you said, it's either going to be too high for some students or too low for others. They will have done it, or they won't be ready for it. And there'll be a tiny group in the middle for whom it will just be right. But you can't be just teaching the tiny group in the middle. You've got to teach the whole thing. Much better to adopt a task-based kind of approach, or a text-based approach, or a theme-based approach, which is much broader in its scope.
All right. How can teachers who haven't got a very good command of the language take advantage of any kind of language that learners give them? Because what we usually see is that teachers, they usually point out mistakes in order to correct it. And if you're focusing on language that emerges in the class, you're not focusing only on mistakes, but also you're getting correct language and asking them to produce it differently and showing them different ways to say that as well. What do you think about this problem that non-native speakers, they tend not to feel confident enough to approach that?
I mean, it's a real problem. I think one of the reasons I think that teachers who lack confidence in their own English, why they prefer, therefore, to have a kind of top-down transmission. Today we're going to do the present perfect continuous because it gives them a lot of control, and it reduces elements of unpredictability. And if you just walk into a classroom and say, you know, talk amongst yourselves and I'll deal with it, you just don't know what's going to come up. And I perfectly sympathize with that point of view. However, there are ways, I think there are ways and techniques of managing that so that the teacher is given kind of sufficient warning. First of all, everybody knows this, I think, who's taught a kind of taskish based teaching style, that you can sort of engineer tasks so that they produce the language that you want. So in other words, I mean, I often ask this to teachers and workshops. See, on the syllabus, you've got the past simple coming up. Now, when are you going to teach this? Are you going to teach this before the Christmas holiday or after the Christmas holiday? And anybody with any sense says, well, you're going to teach it after the Christmas holiday because then they can use it to talk about the Christmas holiday. On the other hand, you've got going to on the syllabus. Are you going to do that before the Christmas holiday or after the Christmas holiday? So in other words, you can predict, take a topic, next weekend, we're going to talk about next weekend, or we're going to talk about the final of the football league or whatever. You can guarantee that students are going to be needing some kind of future structure, so you can kind of anticipate that. So that's one way of giving teachers a little bit of kind of prior warning, as it were, to the language that comes up. Another way is getting them to write things rather than just simply speaking things. It's much easier to deal with student language when it's written down than it is when it's flying around the room. So what I would recommend is if students have been doing some kind of discussion or survey or whatever, let's say go back to my survey about money. So in groups, they've got the questions together. They write the questions down. The teacher goes around, looks at the questions, time to think, time to evaluate the questions, time to correct them. Then the students go around, they ask their questions, blah, 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 put them, different groups, blah, 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 blah. Teacher's not doing anything, just making sure that everybody's on task. Then they have to write the results of their survey. And again, they produce a text. They're working in the group. They go back to the original group that designed the questions. And they go, 10 out of 15 students in this class think that they should get more pocket money, blah, 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 blah. They write it down. And they write it down not because it's going to be corrected by the teacher, because it's going to form the basis of a class report. You're going to stand up. Each group's going to stand up, present. Maybe they do it on a PowerPoint. Maybe they do it on an overhead, whatever. But they're going to present the findings of their thing. So knowing they're going to do that also is very good because it forces a little bit more attention on accuracy. They've written it down perfect. The teacher's got the document. She can take that. She can take it away. She can take it home and say, we'll do the presentation tomorrow, but I'm going to look at this tonight. So she can deal with the emergent language in the privacy of her own home with her grammar book and her dictionary or whatever.
So the teacher's got time to think about it, right, and check.
It's having time to think about it, and writing is perfect. Another technique that I've used often is that, okay, the students have been doing group work, they've had nice conversations, some questions about whatever. Okay, now write down a summary of what you were talking about for the student who's not here today. Yeah, so it's kind of like, who's not here today? Valeria's not here today. Let's write a summary of what we were talking about for Valeria. And then the beauty of that is it gives the task a point, the writing task, because it's like, telling her what she missed. And it also gives an audience, and then of course the teacher can take these texts and use them again for these same purposes. So I think, I think giving yourself some thinking time is very important. That would be one of my recommendations.
Do you think that it's possible for novice teachers to use a Dogme style lesson? I know that in IATEFL 2010, Anthony and I forgot her name.
Lizzie.
Lizzie. They taught. They presented a workshop on unplugging a CELTA course. And I know you were there. I watched the video only. I wasn't there. You and Luke were there in the room, and it seemed to be it seemed to be very successful.
Yes, very successful. It's amazing what those two are doing, and their teacher training courses in Hamburg. I'm really impressed. I think it's very brave, but I don't think it's impossible. And I think what they're doing is they're seizing on some basic classroom management skills, which allow teachers to set up tasks and to deal with the language that comes up in a fairly non-threatening way. Now, they're working, in a sense, at a disadvantage because most of their teachers that they're training are native speaker teachers of English. Now, that's a huge disadvantage because the native speaker teachers of English don't know they know very little about the grammar of English, so they're not in a position actually to deal with student error very authoritatively, because they hear the errors, but they have no idea what the error is called. Whereas your non-native teacher of English is at a much better advantage there, because generally your non-native teachers have gone through the whole process and they know every single thing and label about grammar, so they're in a much better position to deal with this stuff when it comes up. They're not, perhaps, as we said before, as confident that they can always supply a corrected version, particularly the area of idiomatic language or vocabulary, etc. But they have that huge advantage that at least they know how to label things. So it's kind of it swings and roundabouts. But I don't think I think basically the Dogme approach is 90% management. You do need to be a good manager, and most experienced teachers have learned how to manage classes. If they haven't, they shouldn't be doing it. New teachers don't have those management skills, but they need to learn them anyway. New teachers have problems because they don't have management skills. Whether they do a Dogme approach or a course book-based approach, perhaps it's a bit easier to do a course book-based approach, because at least with the bottom line is, if you've got no management skills, you just walk in and say, okay, everybody, page 56.
Exercise 1. One thing that, taking advantage of this talk about experienced teachers, I remember reading one of the texts by Underhill on your website about Teaching Unplugged, in which he was talking about that in the past when I started teaching I did it like this, now I do it differently. And you and Luke, you've claimed in lots of the videos that I've watched about Dogme that this is not something that you had invented out of the blue. It's always been there, but it was important to label it, to give it a name, so that people could talk about it. And it was something that good teachers had been doing for a while. But that would be exactly the point. How do you get to a point in which you're comfortable enough to teach in an environment like that? How important is it for the teachers to have been exposed to different teaching techniques and to learn different teaching techniques so that they can cater for their learners? I know that this won't work with my learner, that won't work with my learner. That would be one of the problems that during our discussions, one of the problems that were pointed out would be exactly that. How can novice teachers know exactly what to do with learners on the spur of the moment, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think we've, in a sense, covered that. I mean, I certainly would slap a kind of health warning onto Dogme for novice teachers. But I think one of the things that why the analogy was attractive to me way back when I was teacher training in-service teachers, because it was kind of disappointing that in-service teachers have been teaching 3, 4, 5, 6 years, whatever, we still seem to be very, very, very course book dependent. We think, well, come on, you guys, I mean, there's life after the course book, and I think actually I was in Turkey a couple of weeks ago, or last month. There was Jack Richards gave a very interesting plenary talk about teacher education, where he traced a part of it. He was kind of reviewing a lot of the research into teacher education, and one of the things he mentioned, which is in a sense kind of obvious, but it's that experienced teachers become much more tend to improvise more and more spontaneous, tend to use materials less, etc. It's just, otherwise life would be really, really boring if they just, every lesson was based on the course book. And they start to realize that the best lessons that they've taught are the ones where they did improvise more. And I think actually if you ask a lot of teachers, and I go around and say, what was the best lesson that you've ever taught? It was often one where something came up completely spontaneously and they ran with it, or they had to go in and substitute for another teacher who wasn't there was no lesson plan, or the lights failed and they had to teach in the dark, all sorts of things. But it's when suddenly they discover that they've got resources, reserves, if you like, that they didn't really realize they had, and that's what makes you a better teacher. And I remember that's really, in a sense, in my own formation as a teacher, was teaching with very minimal materials and teaching large-ish classes in Egypt when I first started teaching. And also doing a lot of substitution classes for teachers who were absent. I learned how to kind of become a good spontaneous teacher as opposed to a bad spontaneous teacher. And I also think that there are a few basic routines that new teachers can be taught, which will always produce a good lesson. And these were things I'm very grateful for having been taught on my pre-service courses. And one of them was dialogue building, just the ability to kind of draw on ideas from the classroom to construct a dialogue and then practice it in pairs and practice it with other pairs and then get up and perform it in front of the class. You could do that with anything. You could do it with any grammar in the world. You could create a dialogue around it. And it needs zero materials.
Yeah, I would like to go back to this about preparation for classes later. But a couple of things that you mentioned about the best classes are usually these classes in which there's a lot of conversation. You actually listen to your learner. This came up a lot during the Dogme challenge ring that Karine asked in her blog, and teachers were responding. And many teachers, they actually said that it was amazing. I went to class just to talk to my learners, and I could actually teach them a fantastic lesson. And they learned much more because things were relevant to them. They were learning things which they wanted to learn.
Yeah. And I think, coming back to your point before, Henrik, if I could just butt in, when you said, yeah, Dogme wasn't a new idea, but it needed a label. I think it needed a label because it needed to be authenticated or validated, as it were. And I think teachers feel guilty if the lesson just turns out to be a lot of chat. They think they should, or if the beginning of the lesson chat kind of expands to fill the whole lesson, they feel guilty. And I think what all the research is telling us is coming through, and has been the last 10 or 15 years, especially into task-based learning, is in fact often this improvised chat is what creates the best learning opportunities for the students. It's the stuff that they remember. It's driven by them, so they have some kind of agency or control over the direction of the discourse, and it throws up the kind of problems that are appropriate for their particular level. So there's a lot of stuff coming through which is saying, don't be guilty, and that's why I'm saying Dogme validates a kind of this stuff that people used to think was peripheral to language learning, and now it's actually moved into the center of language learning.
I couldn't agree more. I think that this is something that teachers usually felt when they say, "What did you do today in class?" We talked, and then they're like, "But didn't you teach them anything? Where's the second conditioner? Where's the third conditioner?" Like, we covered that in a way, right? And it's important for teachers to know that there is learning coming out of that. And
if you do feel guilty, keep a record of, and any good teacher will, I think, keep a record of the vocabulary that comes up in the class on one part of the board, but also the grammar structures and things. And if you want, have a big list of all the grammar structures in your classroom on a poster, and as they come up, just tick them, the number of times they come up. Now, some of them won't come up very often. They may never come up. Things like the third conditional or backshift in reported speech, because it's just not conversational.
Mm-hmm.
And then you could say, well, okay, it didn't come up, probably because it doesn't need to, it's not useful, it's very low frequency. Or you could say, it didn't come up, it's in the exam, so we're going to have a special lesson on it. So it's this kind of retrospective syllabusing, I think, is another approach to it gives the students also confidence that you are aware that they have grammatical needs, but you're not teaching them preemptively, you're teaching them reactively.
Yeah, that's where usually learning takes place, right? That's when usually people learn things, because they tend to, I don't know, it's just about they're paying more attention to that because that's something they needed, they wanted to use, and it's much easier for them to retrieve that later on. Moving on a bit, and now we're in the Brazilian classroom, L1 is mainly spoken. Many teachers in regular schools, classes tend to be taught in Portuguese. It's only about grammar rules, and there's very little room for conversation, especially in English, in the classroom. Is it possible for teachers to at least slowly try to get what's produced in L1 or make use of language 1 of L1 and get to L2? And how could that be done in this kind of context? Is it possible? Can you see a possibility for that?
Yeah, I mean, let me describe a technique you're probably familiar with, which may have some applicability here, and that's the kind of technique which actually uses the fact that students are monolingual and builds on that. So they have conversations where they say what they want to say in Brazilian, in Portuguese, for example, and then the teacher provides a kind of translation or reformulation, and so it goes on. They build up a conversation, and what I'm talking about here is that's the kind of counseling learning, language learning, or community language learning technique, which was developed in this, in the 60s and 70s in the States with small groups. And so what they do is they build up a conversation which they record line by line, but they ask the teacher, how do you say such and such in English? And so it's a constant, she'll translate it, they'll then say it, they'll get it right, then they'll record that sentence, and it may be something as simple as, did you have a nice weekend? And then they pass the record, the whatever, over to the, and they answer it, and the same thing. So the whole thing is mediated, particularly at the lower levels by translation. Now, that only really works with small groups. So you've got a group, say maximum, say 7 or 8 students sitting in a circle, and they build up this conversation. And then the conversation's available. Once it's recorded line by line, then they can play it back and then transcribe it. The teacher can transcribe it on the board, and then it's available for some kind of language work. But as I say, it's only probably, the original CLL technique was only possible with small groups, although I have a colleague in Madrid who teaches in a secondary school. He was teaching in a secondary school in Madrid with large classes, about 30, well, large-ish, 30 kids. And he organized it in such a way that he put them into sort of 2 or 3 large groups, each with a recorder. And then he would just run around. I mean, it kept him fairly busy, but he said it worked. And I've actually seen he filmed it. And he said it was the only thing that worked with these students. They were so unmotivated and so uninterested in English, but when they could get the chance of generating questions, and they had the security of saying, how do you say such and such in English? And the teacher was there to supply it. Then, so now you can also do that other ways. You don't have to have, it doesn't have to be spoken, it can be written. So you can have students writing conversations backwards and forwards to each other on a piece of paper in groups of 3 or 4. It's a bit like online chatting. So they write a question, they pass it on, read it, write the answer, etc. And then the teacher also can be available. So they can say to the teacher, excuse me, miss, how do you say such and such? And she could say, let me think, you would say it like this kind of thing. It does mean that the teacher is having to respond to stuff that comes up. So it comes back to that issue, again, of being confident in your own English, the ability to translate the student's needs. But it accepts the fact that classrooms are bilingual environments, and we'd be mad to pretend that they weren't. And we're not trying to produce students who are monolinguals. We're trying to produce students who are bilingual in Portuguese and English in this case. So there's no reason why the classroom shouldn't be bilingual as well. It's a meeting ground of the 2 languages, and people shouldn't again feel guilty about that. But teachers should be trying to think of techniques where they can transition their students from speaking Portuguese into English at least some of the time.
Thank you. One final question. How can we address a problem of, for example, if you have in a school 20 teachers teaching without following a course book or a syllabus and going to the classroom and seeing what students are supposed to learn? From a management position, you can actually look at that and say, I need some sort of standardization. I need to make sure that all students are learning a certain amount of language. If you go Dogme style when you have 50, 70, 100 teachers, how do you prevent teachers from just doing what they want to do, and there are some teachers who might not be doing it so well, or they just have a conversation in class, not a lesson actually. Is there any kind of advice that you could give in that regard, or no?
Well, one of the things we've always said about Dogme is it has to be adapted for its context, and it would be hypocritical of it to be. It's not a method in a sense that one size fits all kind of thing. That it needs to be adapted, and some contexts are more have more constraints than others. I mean, everything you describe about Brazil, for example, seems very similar to the public education system in Spain as well. And there's a limited scope for teachers to innovate, perhaps, on a scale that Dogme might suggest. So one way around that is simply to say, well, teachers should take advantage where they come up of what we call Dogme moments, where there is a chance for spontaneous language use, but the bulk of the time they're probably working towards, with a course book towards the, following the syllabus towards the exam, etc. On the other hand, at the other extreme, you could say, yeah, I mean, it's possible to imagine a school where, all the teachers are teaching to their own agenda, and it sounds like chaos, but in fact, probably it's a very happy school because the teachers will be happy and the students will be happy. And one hopes that if they're using a lot of English in the class and they're getting help with their English in ways that are relevant to their needs, then they will be all progressing in a sense, not necessarily at the same pace in the same areas, but what classrooms ever do. The idea that you can control the way people learn, like you control the way chickens lay eggs by saying, today everybody's going to be teaching this lesson. It's a nonsense. Humans are just not like that. And language learning, particularly, is not something that you can schedule. So you might as well, in some ways, say, well, let's just everybody enjoy learning English by having them shape the lessons much more themselves, and then hopefully, if nothing else, the motivation factor will kick in, and they'll do better than students who are being frog-marched through some kind of grammar syllabus.
Could you say that's something
but it's an act of faith. I mean, it's an act of faith.
It's an act of faith, right? Teachers should be actually, that would be somehow related to the idea of scaffolding in the classroom, right?
Absolutely. One of the training techniques, one of the teacher training techniques that I would recommend for teacher trainers to do is show examples of teachers scaffolding learners' utterances and work on that. So it's not just all about correcting students, but it's like saying, yeah, I know what you're trying to say. This is how you could say it better, kind of thing. Sorry, go on.
I said that was the last question. There's just one more thing I said before I would go back to that. Many people, when they talk about Dogme as well, one of the criticisms is that, so you don't plan your lessons, you don't do anything. Do you think that there's a lot of planning involved in a Dogme lesson, but very little preparation? Or
well, I'd say somebody once put it on the Dogme list, on the discussion list, that a Dogme teacher doesn't prepare, but is prepared.
Yeah.
In the sense that you're prepared for everything and anything, but you don't necessarily have a flight plan, I mean, maybe, again, that would be perhaps an extreme statement of the case, and most teachers don't have that kind of freedom and are accountable to their students, apart from anything else, and their students' parents and so on, to be shown to be, thinking ahead, planning, etc. But I think there are possible ways of compromising whereby planning towards topics and tasks, going back to what we were talking about earlier, rather than to grammatical structures, that kind of planning would seem to be perfect. Planning speaking tasks which do generate language and then reacting to those tasks. So you don't exactly know what's going to come up, but you can have a certain clear idea. So yeah, a certain amount of readiness, I think, and preparedness, and then also maybe having different options. So you think, well, my lesson plan, this is where I'll start. We'll start just talking about the weekend and that. Now, it could go this way or it could go that way. If it goes this way, then X, Y, Z. If it goes this way, then maybe I'll have to do A, B, C kind of thing. So you've got a kind of a lesson plan which is more like a flow chart.
Thank you very much, Scott. This was amazing. I'm pretty sure that we're going to cover what we wanted to, and we're going to accomplish what we wanted to with this interview with the Brazilian teachers. I think that they can have a much better idea of what Dogme is, and just at least some ideas and some possible solutions to start changing things a bit in our educational system here and the way that we teach English.
Actually, just the final point, Henrick, I think the thing about Dogme is it's less about changing the system. It's more about changing teachers and changing their attitudes and giving them. And I think one of the gratifying things about Dogme is the number of teachers who have come up to me and to Luke, etc., at conferences and said, you know what, I did a Dogme lesson and it really made me feel better as a teacher. I suddenly realized, how to connect again to the students. And I think this is incredibly good news. So if nothing else, it's just an excuse to do a little bit of personal development as a teacher by just trying something new, and you can always go back to. I mean, that reference you made to Adrian Underhill's article on the Dogme site, he said himself that when you teach without a course book for a while, it makes you a better teacher of a course book when you go back to it.
Exactly. I thank you very much for that correction. It's about changing in your mindset, right? The way you look at teaching and learning. And but thank you very much, and I hope we can do this more often. Who knows? And we're all waiting. We're all waiting for you in Brazil, right?
Henrick, I know. I'd love to go. It's been so long. It's been far too long.
Yeah, there's Breast Diesel in 2012.
I know. Unfortunately, I work in New York in the summer, and it's always in the summer.
Oh yeah.
Breast Diesel in July, isn't it? So it
just
conflicts with my schedule, but it's. It grieves me mightily because I love Brazil, and any chance to come back, I will take it.
I'm sure you're going to get some invitations. Thank you so much, Scott. It's been really fun.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Everybody.